Hello, welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live. We're here today to talk about AWS Organizations and also just generally like how you manage all these multiple cloud accounts. So I'm David Hill. I'm a this is a good start. Can't even get my own title out. Global technologist in Veeam's product strategy office of the CTO. And one of my big focuses is around cloud native technologies, public clouds and things. And today I'm joined with my friend and colleague, Anthony Spiteri. So Anthony, a few welcome words from you.
Yeah, hey David, I don't know if I can trip up like you in the first couple of seconds, but I'll say what I can do.
Yeah, did well.
It's midnight over here as well, mate, in Perth, Western Australia. So if anyone's going to trip up, it's going to be me. But no, I haven't been on for a while. So my name's Anthony Spiteri, and I'm a senior global technologist in the product strategy group at Veeam as well, with a focus on the service provider technology, but everything cloud as well. So yeah, looking forward to having a discussion over the next 20 minutes about something that's near and dear to both of us.
Yeah, and you can also tell as well that while the rest of the world is baking in the summer, obviously in Australia it's the middle of winter, so you're looking pretty cold today, mate.
Well, it's spring. We have the first 3 days of spring, but it's 2 degrees at the moment. It's not like it. I'm just going to blame global warming. Why not?
Yeah, so it's always the way now. So what we're going to talk about today is generally like, I want to focus on AWS organizations, but also talk about some of the other public cloud providers and how you can do similar things. And if we start off with AWS organizations and what is it and what does that allow you to do? And one of the things that we find from a product strategy perspective here at Veeam is we all have our own cloud accounts. So I have like my own AWS account where I run my own workloads. I got one in Azure, I got one in GCP. Anthony has one as well. And we have total control over that. But as you can imagine, there's quite a few people in the product strategy group, and we have things like billing and considerations around that. So we're going to put a little focus on how you manage all these multiple accounts, whether it's focusing on it from like a per business unit perspective, where you have like finance, HR, that kind of thing, or whether you have individual people as well. And I asked Anthony to join us because he's got a good perspective on this. He's been obviously doing a lot of stuff around like private clouds or vCloud director, service provider clouds as well. So he can bring a very unique perspective to this, how we see this out in the industry. But one of the things I want to first focus on is what the actual challenges that we find. So if we can bring some slides up here, where we can show here, and Spiteri, you're becoming quite famous now. So the first thing here is we see, quite obvious, Anthony has his own AWS cloud account. He runs some instances in VPCs. He's got some object storage buckets. But if we move on to the next slide, what we see is that we have more people who are doing essentially the same things. They're all running some EC2 instances, they're all using object storage buckets. Now, in this scenario, what you'd find is like Anthony would be submitting his own expense reports for his own AWS. Rick Vanover, obviously quite popular in the Veeam space, would be doing the same, and alongside Michael Cade. Now, how can you manage all this from a centralized billing and also just an organizational perspective? And if we move to the next slide, what Anthony and I are going to talk about is how you can actually look and use a single kind of AWS master account, if you want to look at it that way, a centralized billing mechanism that essentially picks up the bill for all these accounts. So you don't have individuals running multiple expense reports, and you can also define policies across all these different accounts as well. So we'll start off and just say, Anthony, from your past experiences with like individual AWS accounts, what have been some of the challenges that you've seen just out in the industry around how all these different people come together, how these businesses run all these different essentially business units out in the public cloud space, whether you're a service provider or just a private enterprise who's looking at these, what kind of challenges have you seen out in this space?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest challenge is just general organization and awareness of what resources are out there, right? I mean, the thing about the cloud is when you can enter your credit card and spin up any resource anywhere, there's an inherent part of danger in that, right? Where, costs can get out of control, but also it's just about knowing that, if person X in department Y is creating an EC2 instance, what are they doing on there as well? Who's paying for that, but what are they putting out there? So I think control is so important in the cloud world. Certainly back in the day before AWS had this particular feature, because David, I don't know how long they've actually had this in play for, but from our point of view, thinking back, 10 years now, when say VCD first came out, that was kind of the first sort of thing that really started to segment off cloud instances into what was called, virtual data centers, organizations, and that sort of thing. And that was important because, what I've found is that, individually, companies wanted to come in and create certain segments for particular, parts of their business, and then protect that and isolate it from other parts of their business as well. So that's obviously the big part there. So, when I think about it, I think about business control awareness, but I think cost control really comes into play. And that's certainly why I think we had to sort of play with it in our own space, right? Because everyone was doing everything and we were getting large bills individually. And we wanted to make sure that collectively we were kind of going and running our bills as per what was set out by the business.
Yeah. So yeah, budgeting and chargeback and that kind of thing is always been kind of, I would say it's probably been one of the biggest challenges from a public cloud perspective. Not only
Chargeback,
it's how when you look at enterprises in general, just who's paying for all this? When you're looking at all these cloud instances in the on-premises data center or private clouds, the hardware costs money. Who's paying for these resources and that kind of thing? And we're just going to kind of interrupt our talk and just say that for everybody who's on the call, we always like to bring up a map to show where people are coming from. So if we can bring that map up,
all right.
And we can see here that we've got quite a lot of people coming in. So we've got people here saying where they're from. So we've got Texas, that's obviously me. Don't let my accent fool you. Ohio, New Jersey. We're over in Brazil and I believe Kenya and Italy, the Netherlands. We've obviously got Anthony out in Australia, so
Israel as well. So we're well spread tonight, actually.
Yeah, so we're doing really well. So keep posting where you're from. We love seeing where we are, and we'll bring the map up again in a little bit later in this LinkedIn Live. But going back to the topic of billing and chargeback, that you kind of touched on it exactly when we were talking about how within product strategy, we all were doing our individual things. So you'd be off spinning up resources and leveraging object storage for stuff, and I'd be doing the same. But there was no centralized control over what we were actually spending. And that, as a group, a business unit within Veeam personally was quite worrying when, you could be spending $2,000-$3,000 a month. I could be doing the same. We saw on those slides of the people as well. There was no kind of centralized cost control over what we were actually spending. And when we look at AWS organizations, being able to bring in this centralized management of all the accounts, and it's really simple to do as well. So anyone who's not looked at AWS organizations, just when you log into the AWS console, go and have a look at AWS organizations, and you can see how it works. You can add already existing AWS accounts and bring those in, and you can set up so you take ownership of all the billing. You can leave it so what we've actually done in our case is each one of us all has our own root credentials. So excuse me, Spiteri has his own credentials, same as I do, Rick does. So you still own that account. But what happens is that the centralized account actually picks up the bill for all those. So it receives the invoice for all those accounts. So it's one master bill. But also it goes further, and you can actually specify what resources that you would actually want to like restrict. So you can actually say, for example, I don't want Spiteri and K to be going running any Kubernetes services because we know it can get expensive. I can specify that Rick can't go and do any EC2 instances. So if you take that away from being individual persons and think about it from a business unit perspective, you can actually drive that quite significantly to manage the resources. You can also set budgets as well, which is quite important. And what I would say is moving away from just AWS, if you think about it from a service provider perspective, how would you kind of approach that from being a service provider offering services out to customers as well, Anthony? Like you mentioned like VCD offerings, but just in general from a service provider space, would that be any different? Would you have to manage that differently, or could you even create that as a service? What kind of examples can you give us from the service providers?
Well, looking at the way that it's structured, just taking the parallel of the AWS organization stuff, you've got the root, and then you've got your OUs, and then you can have nested OUs under that, and then member accounts. For an MSP or for a cloud service provider, they could absolutely effectively, structure this to basically manage their own customers, their own partners, and basically control the billing as well. So it's a really interesting way that they can actually do that. And I know that in not just AWS, but say in Azure, this is absolutely being done where, partners are coming in, MSPs, and they're managing resources for them and allocating certain resources and certain controls to their customers to be able to do what they want to do, but the billing all goes through the service provider. So, I think this has been a good evolution of the public clouds, because before this, the public clouds were not really the realm of the cloud or managed service provider because they had no control over it, right? So with all these coming into play, I think it allows MSPs to further leverage, the resources that are out there on the public clouds. And I think that becomes then an extension of their own offerings, and they start to become this broker of services where they can all bill through, potentially one console. I'm sure, like anything in AWS, this organization construct has a really solid API at the back end, so you can pull the billing out, you can pull that into your own systems and just control it end to end. So it's tremendously powerful from that perspective as well.
Yeah, and you touched on some good points there actually about how the clouds didn't really have this kind of capability until a few years ago. And we have exactly the same problems when you look at Microsoft Azure and you look at GCP as well. And obviously from a Veeam perspective, we have offerings for all three of those public clouds. So with Veeam backup for AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. So from our own business unit perspective, we obviously have capabilities and offerings running in all those three public clouds. And when you look at Microsoft Azure as an example, they have a similar kind of aspect to this, but it's not in the same frame as like AWS Organizations. You have the ability to actually take like billing ownership of individual subscriptions. So we have a similar approach where we have a centralized Microsoft Azure account, and that has all the billing included in that, so like credit cards, that kind of thing. And then everybody, so myself, Anthony, and so on, we just transfer billing ownership over to that account. So again, in the same way we were talking with the AWS aspects where you have like your root access and everything like that, you have all that control over that Microsoft Azure account, but the bill is picked up by a centralized account. Yeah. So what actually happens is it makes it very easy to manage all that. But what I will say is to kind of ask you another question, Anthony, is have you experienced any challenges with it? Have what?
No. Well, I was going to actually, I thought of a really good analogy to use actually. So think about, someone who's, expensing part of a company and going out and expensing, not that we're doing that a lot these days, but if you were going out and even expensing some IT gear on your own credit card, then you have to get reimbursed. What a pain that is, right? To be able to have to go in and get the permission to reimburse everything. So, just think about this as basically laying everything on the company credit card and you don't need to worry about it, right? That's kind of an analogy that I thought. But yeah, I think I was like, I was a little bit sort of skeptical to go down this path initially, but it's been pretty easy, right? Because I still use the AWS console like I did before. The only difference is I don't get a bill, but nothing else changes, right? But what I wanted to ask you, David, was how does this kind of come into play with our backup for AWS? Because obviously that's got multi-organization, sort of multi-tenant reach in it. Does this help in that sense? When someone's looking to deploy Veeam backup for AWS?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So from a Veeam backup for AWS perspective, as you mentioned, we're able to protect multiple AWS accounts. So regardless of whether you don't need AWS Organizations for that, but what you can do with Veeam backup for AWS is actually protect all the workloads across all those accounts. So in this example that Anthony mentioned there, and we showed in the slides where you have those 3 accounts in that master account, you can actually deploy Veeam backup for AWS in, say, that master account, and then protect the workloads across all those individual accounts under AWS Organizations. And there's easy ways to do that through like AWS IAM, so the identity and access management. You can create centralized roles across all these accounts, or you can use individual IAM roles in these individual accounts as well. So it gives you a lot of power and capabilities to manage everything centrally, not only just from that billing perspective, but also from a permissions perspective. Or you can just do it individually as well and manage your own AWS accounts through that. So I'm going to bring the map up again, and we'll have a quick.
Got some good ones here.
Yeah. So come on, Anthony, you're great with geography. Where are we looking at now?
All right. So it looks like we've got Atlanta, Missouri, so obviously states in the US. Germany, I think I see Switzerland there. Wish I was able to go back to Switzerland. What a great country that is. And then some place that we haven't had before, I believe it's a first, Bhutan. I think I've pronounced that right. But yeah, there you go.
Wow. So yeah, we've got first all the time now. So
yeah. And also, David, as well, it must be said, we just want to make sure that we're welcoming today on the live stream. We're tri-casting this across LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So I remember back in the day when we started this last year, when we're doing these, it was only one. You could pick one. But now we've got the technology to be able to go to all 3 at once and choose your poison. So thanks for joining.
Yeah. So yeah, tri-casting. Who'd have thought that a few years ago? So yeah, and for me personally as well, these LinkedIn lives and Facebook lives and YouTube lives, whatever live we're going to call it today, that I think they're really valuable as well, and we get a lot of feedback. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask us, post in the comments on those sites, and we'll actually be able to answer them while we're talking as well. So what I kind of just talk a little bit about as well is we've touched on how bringing all these accounts together is kind of important from a centralized business management perspective, but also from that security perspective. We hear a lot about ransomware and that kind of thing. And I'm going to kind of call you out here, Anthony, because I do like to remind everybody how you once posted all your private keys. Or was it GitHub you put it on? Tell the story of what you did with your keys.
It was only the one private key actually that I secret and private key that I posted up. I was doing some Terraform and I had a project and I decided to upload the project. I commit it. And I did realize almost straight away that I had put my key up there, took it down within 2 minutes, but it was too late. And I was basically compromised. Everything got deleted, and a bunch of crypto servers got spun up. And probably back in those days, it might have been good to keep them going, given how that's gone. But anyway, it wasn't good. And yeah, so it was just a really bad security lapse for me. But it happens a lot.
Yeah, and I know I kind of called you out on it, but it's a great example of how even, I would like to say, technologists things can happen, and things that you don't realize or you forget about can very easily, from a security perspective, become a data breach. And from that perspective, when we're looking at how you manage all these accounts, always bearing in mind the security aspects of it as well is really important. So with things like AWS Organizations and being able to put those restrictions in place on policies can actually help you minimize those security risks. So, maybe we could have put a policy in place that only allowed Anthony to do very specific things, so those crypto servers that you mentioned didn't get spun up by accident, that kind of thing. So it's a great real world example of where, purely innocent things that you do can actually cause you some challenges. And we've all done it, the amount of times that I've created the wrong firewall rule or something like that. So being aware of how all these different accounts are now being used by all these different business units is really important as well. And I think that's the big challenge that we face now. And from a security perspective, how you manage all these different environments, and certainly when we look at multi-cloud, how we manage them. So Anthony, what kind of examples would you give when you're talking to your service providers about security aspects? Because from a service provider perspective, their business is making sure that their customers' services are running, but they obviously have all these different people doing different things. Is there any kind of best practices around helping service providers manage that for their customers? Any recommendations that you've seen in your past lives as well that we could talk about?
It was always a worry back in the day that, a customer would get compromised or someone would do something, dodgy on a system. But I think back then it was all about logging. That was a big thing. Like, how can you log what's happening? And that was a challenge back in the day. I mean, now that it's kind of built into most platforms, right, where you can audit what's going on. But even 5 years ago, that wasn't really prevalent in the industry. But I think I think it's all about education and security now as well. So really making sure that gateway in to the console or to the place where someone can do something is protected. And now we've got tokenized access, two-factor authentication, all that sort of stuff adds to the security to stop something bad happening. But there's bigger challenges now because now people are accessing code. You've got these DevOps deploying through APIs, through infrastructure as code, somewhat uncontrolled, somewhat trusted automatically. So it's a really interesting time. So again, having those guardrails up is so critical. But I think the tools are out there more than ever today.
Yeah, and that's, I always think the big thing now is no matter what environment you're running is making sure that you can you're able to not only understand the different requirements for the different platforms and whatever you're doing, but also being able to essentially monitor what's going on in there. Whether it is AWS, Azure, Google, VCD, some a cloud service provider, whatever you're doing. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I want to kind of just tee up while we're here that we don't have any shows on Monday because it's a US holiday on Monday, and obviously the world tends to follow what's going on in America. So, but next Friday we have a LinkedIn Live with Rick Vanover, Melissa Palmer, and Zane Allen, who's with Pure Storage, and they're going to give you some straight talking about ransomware. And essentially how to cut through that kind of ransomware noise and get to what's important for your organization. Because we hear all the time, we've even mentioned ransomware briefly today, but it's massive. So come along on Friday next week to talk about ransomware. Listen to Melissa and Rick and Zane about ransomware and what's happening. And I think we can bring the map up one last time.
Yeah, and hey, David, as well. Also, just to mention, on the 13th of September, there's going to be the first in a 3-part series with Jason Buffington and Melissa Palmer, again, talking about DR and taking a deep dive into all things disaster recovery. And if you've kept up with Melissa Palmer's TikTok of late, you'll see that she's all over the DR. So that's a great one to tune into as well.
When was that one?
On the 13th of the 9th.
Perfect. Brilliant. So 13th of September. So let's bring the map up one last time. And I believe we have a special guest. We have Dave Russell tuning in as well from Colorado. So anyone who's been following along the Veeam LinkedIn Lives know that Dave Russell's our kind of star celebrity. He's our Vice President of Enterprise Strategy, and he's really good in these LinkedIn Lives. So it's nice that our colleagues are tuning in as well. And we're kind of coming to the end of this now. And I just kind of want to finish off with one last question with you, Anthony, around where do you see this just public cloud in general going? You know, people talk about how the data center is going to die and public cloud's going to be the only kind of service available. Do you really believe that, you know, or what do you see the next few years of just cloud in general being?
Well, I don't. At one point I did, but you know, maybe 5-6 years later, I've realised, and the industry has sorted itself out to really, instead of the destination being what drives it, the application and the workload is driving where these applications are actually living, right? So I think that's more the point. So it's all driven by the application, which is driven by the business. That's driven where things will land. So it's going to be a combination of public cloud, on-premises, service provider hosted. It's all going to do its part together in this ecosystem to provide a business with the tooling to be able to do what they want. Software as a service as well obviously fits into that, platform as a service, whatever it is. So the short answer is no, public cloud is not the panacea. That's the what I used to say quite a bit, that people thought it was a panacea. But that said, it's becoming more useful. But even just in this little example with the organization in AWS, just shows you that they're thinking bigger. You know, they're not just thinking about an EC2 instance anymore. They're thinking about how organizations can consume this on a bigger scale, but more efficiently as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you for your insights. We're going to kind of wrap up there now. We're coming to the end of this. Thank you so much for joining, Anthony. It's great to have you on. It's always good to see you live on camera. So thanks for staying up at midnight as well to come talk to us. So thank you, everyone. I hope this was beneficial, and we'll see you again soon.
See you later.